Welcome to another inspirational message from Chowdean Community Church, Gateshead. For more information about Chowdean, visit www.chowdean.org.uk. We hope you enjoy the podcast.
Going off into the unknown. And that's what we're going to look at this morning in Abraham. We're going to look at Genesis 12 to Genesis 25. Got some little headings up there that might help. Embracing the unknown. And that's something that you and I do every day. From the day we get out of bed and put our feet to the floor, we're embracing the unknown. And we do not know what that day may bring us. A phone call, a letter, a neighbor, something at work, something wherever we go. We're always facing the unknown. But God called a man called Abram, as he was at the time this story starts. And Abram was called by God to become a traveling pensioner. Now, last week we heard about Noah, and we heard that Noah was a very elderly gentleman when God told him to build an ark and take all his family to safety. And we have another man today who's 75 years old when the call of God came to him. Now, when we had the communion service last week, I sat down and I counted the number of people who I thought were over 75. And forgive me if I put you in the wrong bracket, but I think there were 25 people that came forward for communion last week that were 75 and over. And that's quite a large number of our congregation when you look around and see how many there are of us. And so, don't think, because we're elderly, that God hasn't got something for us to do. Now, Abram was a wealthy man. He had many cattle, he had lots of gold, he had lots of silver, and he lived in Ur of the Chaldees, which is the modern-day Iraq, and he was a man who life was nice for him, but he had no child. That was his sadness, he had no child. And God called him to an unknown destination, which God would guide him to, and he went with unquestioning obedience. And God told him that if he obeyed him, he would become a great blessing for himself and to the entire world, and the world would be blessed through him. Now, I have no idea if God called me, and I'm actually older than Abraham was then, I don't know how I would feel. I have no idea. I traveled from the south of England to the northeast, and I thought that was a big enough adventure. I've never been to Mozambique, and I certainly didn't ever get called to do what Abraham was asked to do. But he was married to a lady called Sarai, and he was obviously a man of dependability and unquestioning faith. And that was part of his character. But as we unfold this story this morning, we're going to find how his character grows. And I think that's something that we should remember of ourselves. We start out in life when we're young, and we're not the people that we eventually become. Through things in life, our characters develop. We don't always start out with a full package that we finish up with, and it's something that we should remember. So now Abram has been chosen by God, he's been called, and God gives him a covenant. He puts it in place, a binding agreement between God and Abram. And so the covenant begins with him, his obedience. And he starts on a journey into the unknown with all of his possessions and all of his wealth and his wife. And he has a family. He's got a nephew called Lot. And as soon as I say Lot, you'll remember. If you don't know anything else about the story, you'll remember Lot's name. And Lot has a family, a wife and daughters. And they go on this very long journey. Now just remember, there's not a number 7 bus at the end of the road. This is a journey on foot. It's hard work walking in dusty, hot circumstances. And so if you have a look at a map, you'll see how far they walked. It was a long way. And God tells them to go to Canaan. Now, that's a name that is very familiar to many of us who read the New Testament. And Canaan has been very, very big in the Jewish history. And as we unfold this story, we'll see the name of Canaan mentioned again. And it's part of the story, and it's where Moses led the people. The promised land was Canaan. So it's something we're very familiar with. It's a land of Canaan was divided for the 12 tribes. It was where Jesus ministered a lot. It was where Jesus performed his first miracle of turning the water into wine. So it's very, very important in the history of the Jewish nation, the land of Canaan. Now, when Abram left Ur and the Chaldees, he went from a highly developed cultural society into a very, very unknown one. Now, let's have a think. What would have happened and what would have been the outcome if Abram hadn't responded to God's call? None of those things would have happened, the Moses story and all the stories, if Abram hadn't been obedient and done what God told him. Then how would the story of Jesus ever unfold? And what I wanted us to think about was, we read the Bible in chunks sometimes. We did a little last year where we read the whole of the New Testament, and we read it through like a novel, which I thought was a wonderful idea. But we're rather inclined to read the Bible in little chunks, and we get little bits of stories, but we don't get the overall view. And I think that's what we often see is, we see the little cameo, but we don't see God's big picture. He often doesn't want us to. He often wants to reveal it to us. So when the different people in the church have been asked to speak on these topics, we've been given a different character. We've been given a remit for certain things. But one thing we're asked to look at was, did the character you're speaking about have any blind spots? Now, I don't know if you've got blind spots. If you have, you'll know about them. And I know I certainly have. But Abram, at this time in the story, had a blind spot. Now, he traveled down to Egypt after he'd gone to Canaan because there was a famine in the land. And he wanted, obviously, to protect his wife and Lot's family. And so they had to go to Egypt for food. And he realized when he got to Egypt that Sarah, who was a very beautiful lady, that if the Egyptian hierarchy saw her, they would want to take her. And so he told her to tell them that she was his sister and not his wife. And it was to protect himself. So that was his blind spot. He told a lie and got her involved in it to protect himself, because he knew that if they saw how beautiful she was, they'd probably kill him, and then they could have access not only to Sarah, but obviously all of Abram's wealth as well. He knew his life would be in danger, so he involved her in the lie. And the lie had repercussions. And Sarah was taken to Pharaoh, into his harem, and eventually she married him. And Abram was given, as a result of all of that, a lot more wealth. And in that wealth were slaves and females. And as we see in a little bit, we'll see how that lie, and then because of the lie, the wealth that he was given, it actually becomes a thorn in his flesh. Lying always has consequences. And the female slave, one of them possibly was Hagar, and as the story unfolds, we'll see what happens about that. So remember the name of Hagar. Now we move on to family concerns. Now that seems a strange title to give it when the man involved, Abram, doesn't have a family. But they had to leave Egypt in a hurry because by this time the Egyptians had realized that Sarai was Abram's wife and not his sister. And so to get rid of them, they give them lots of wealth and off they go. And they escape the mess in Egypt and they travel to Bethel, where it becomes evident when you read in God's word and you read the Bible that both their respective herdsmen, now just remember these two men, Lot and Abram, their wealth is mostly in sheep because that was a commodity that you traded with, you ate the flesh, you wore the clothes, and it was a tradable commodity. And the herdsmen of these two men, they were warring with each other, and they were odds, and there was trouble brewing. And it was all over which of the fertile land they were going to have. And Abram, to avoid potential conflict, he allowed Lot to choose where he wanted to tether his, well, you don't tether sheep, do you? It'd be difficult tethering sheep. But he gave him the choice of where which land he wanted. It was a very fertile place, and Lot was given the choice, and he chose the best. But after that incident, eventually Lot and his family, they finish up in Sodom, and we all know what happens there. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I only have to say the word Sodom, and immediately, if you've never read this story before, you'll know what happened there. Now, the thing we need to know when we're reading all of this, or we are just listening to this story, is that Abraham's character all the time was being defined by his actions. Now, I don't think we can have a good character if the actions of our lives don't show those things. We can have bad characters, and mostly the actions will be shown through our actions. But I would like us to think that, as God is unfolding this story in Abram's life, his actions are defined by what he does. His character is defined by what he does. And on numerous occasions, as you read the story through, when something momentous happens, on each occasion, he builds an altar. Now remember, there's no church, they're out in the open, and so he builds an altar to worship on, and he worships God in good and difficult times. And when they leave that place, they leave a permanent reminder of God's presence and faithfulness. And that struck me many times when I was reading this story, several times preparing to do this morning. A permanent reminder. So other people were coming across these altars, and it would remind them of God's presence and his faithfulness. So Lot continues, and off he goes, and he lives in Sodom. And we know the story of the degradation and the vile things that went on in that city. And there were many warring tribes, and they wanted to break into Sodom and steal its wealth and steal its people, including Lot. And that's what happens. Lot gets captured, and his family. And the story goes on to tell us that Abraham and his men rescue Lot. And they rescue Lot, and they return to the king of Sodom the people, and there's a lot of loot. A lot of loot. And so they're returning the people and the loot to the king of Sodom. But king of Sodom is so grateful for getting his people back that he says to Abraham, you can keep the loot. You can, as a thank you from me, you can keep the loot. And so another part of Abraham's character gets revealed because he has integrity. And he declines the spoils, and he says, I have solemnly promised Jehovah that I would not take even a thread from you. He doesn't take anything from the king, but he does be generous to his allies, and he does give loot to them. So here we have a man who is growing in stature. As he gets to know God better and he obeys God more, his character begins to change. And God reminds Abram that he will defend him and give him great blessings. But Abram says, what are the good of all these blessings if I don't have a son? So God, ever caring of those he loves, he takes him outside his tent at night time to look up into the heavens. Now, I hope you know a little bit about this story. It'll tell you on the screen which chapter that's in. I've forgotten now. But Abraham goes outside and he looks up into the night sky. And God says this to him. Your descendants will be like the stars, too numerous to count. And Abram believed God, and he considered him righteous on account of his faith. Now, I think that's the key verse of the whole of this story about Abraham. He went out into the night sky and he looked up, and God told him, a man who is ancient and hasn't got a son, that he is going to be the father of many people, and that people will be blessed through him. And he believes God, and he is considered by God righteous on account of his faith. We would think that we would like to be like that. Now, I've given the next title, Giving God a Helping Hand. This is in chapter 16. Now, I don't know what you're like in your life, but quite often when I think I can see the way ahead in things to do with church or my personal life or my family life, I give a helping hand. I'm not asked for it. I just do it. And we do that sometimes with God. And that's where so many of us go wrong, because we think we'll hurry things along a little bit because God maybe promised you something, it hasn't been fulfilled, and so you think you'll give God a helping hand. And that's exactly what happened in this story. So Abram's wife, Sarah, she intervened, and she proposed that Abram take another wife. And they'd been in Canaan about 10 years. There was still no sign of a baby. And so Abram married Sarah's maid. That's a recipe for disaster, if you like. But the maid had a name called Hagar, and she was an Egyptian. So she was probably some of the spoils that came from that lie. That was the point I was trying to make before. She was part of the spoils of that lie that he did to protect himself. And yes, the goods came out of Egypt to Abram and to Lot. But from that came really disaster. And so things got out of hand. And Abram marries Hagar, but there's strife between the two ladies. Now, you would know that would happen as a lady. You wouldn't need anybody to tell you that if your husband took another wife, there would be friction. And so Hagar runs away. But God keeps an eye on her. At this time, she's pregnant with a son, although no scans, so she wouldn't know it was a son. But she was proud and arrogant. And Sarah complained to Abraham. She said, I'm sick of this woman causing all this trouble. And Abraham said to her, right, well, you can punish her in any way you wanted to. And so she punished her by beating her. And so the girl ran away. But God had an amazing thing to happen in that young woman's life. She now was going to have a son, and that son, too, would be the leader of a great nation. And once we read God's word, instead of the little cameos, we read it in its entirety, we see that that was where the splitting came. And we have the Jewish nation here, and we have the Arabic nations here, and all of that came about through Hagar having a son. So we move on to chapter 17, and the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. And this is something that I had never appreciated before, although I thought I knew these stories. That God appears to Abraham. Now, we might just say that as a word, but can you imagine what that would be like? The awesomeness of being visited by God. He comes to Abraham on more than one occasion, and Abram falls down in the dust on his feet as God spoke to him, and a contract was made between God and Abram, and God changed their names. So no longer is he Abram, he's now Abraham, and no longer is she Sarai, she's now Sarah. And he gave them a new beginning. Now, we talked a few Sundays ago about God being the God of second chances. And I'm so glad he's the God of second chances, because if he wasn't the God of second chances, I wouldn't be here today. So we're a very fortunate people that God gives us a second and a third and a fourth. He gives us many chances. And then when he changes their names, he tells them that they will be Abram will be the father, not only one nation, but multitude of nations. And Abraham is known as the father, not only to the Jewish nation, to Christianity, but also to the Muslims. He is father. What an amazing God we have. But God said to Abram, there is a contract for you to obey. And it's through you that I'm going to bless the nations. And Abram at this time is 100 years old. And he must have thought that God meant Ishmael, Hagar's son. But God said to him, no, your wife, who is also very elderly, this time next year she'll bear a son, and you'll call him Isaac. His name will be Laughter. And so when Abram told Sarah that she was going to have a child next year, she laughed, as I would have done if somebody told me now. If somebody told me if I was going to have a child now, I think I'd die of shock. So they must have realized when God promised them that there was going to be a son next year, that God didn't actually need a helping hand. And I think that's also a message to us all, that we don't have to interfere in the things of God. God has a plan. It's part of his plan, and he'll unfold it in his time. So we have two ladies now, one who has a son and is going to be a leader of a great nation, and an elderly lady who at some stage in the near future will be expecting a child, and through that child the nations of the world will be blessed. See, these are not little stories in isolation. This is now opening up to be what actually has happened in history. So another aspect of Abram that I like, well, he's Abraham now, and he pleads with God for Sodom. Now, you're all familiar with that story. Even people that don't normally go to church will know about Sodom and Gomorrah. We won't dwell too much on the story, only as so much as to say that this part of Abraham's character now shows great compassion. He's moved on from family concern, but he has great compassion, and he shows what tenacity he had. And I also think that he had quite a bit of, well, I'm not quite sure what the word would be, but he seems confident with God that he can plead with God for the people of Sodom. And so he asked God, if there's only 50 people that say they love you, will you save the city? And you know the story, that he goes from 50 to 40 to 30 to 20. And Abraham says, if there's only 10, God, will you save the city? And obviously the city doesn't get saved, and we know the story of what happens to Lot. But it's that little part of the story shows another aspect of Abram's character, that he was a man of great compassion. And now the ultimate test in chapter 21. The ultimate test, and I've called it no turning back, because this is something which I don't think any of us in this room today will ever be called to do. But the birth of Isaac comes, and as with all new babies, and we've got quite a few babies here today. I've just seen beautiful little twin girls come in here today, as well as all the other lovely babies. And I would like to say to you, church, that I don't know about you, but it's thrilling to see all these little ones coming to church. It's thrilling. And I was just saying to John before, no sooner are they babies than they're like little Layla, who was sitting up on the platform. She's, a little while ago she couldn't walk, and here she is with her mummy sitting up there. So it's lovely, isn't it? And the birth of babies brings much joy and much happiness. But the birth of this baby, because of Hagar and Sarah, once again there was friction. And Sarah didn't like the way that Ishmael treated Isaac. Probably used to go around and nip him when nobody was looking. He was his half-brother. I don't know, maybe his mother encouraged him, I don't know. And so she didn't like the treatment of little Isaac. So the first really, really hard test for Abraham is that he has to organize for Hagar and Ishmael, Hagar's son, to leave and go on a journey for their protection. And he has no idea where they'll go. He won't be able to know how they're getting on, and he'll have no means of getting in touch with them. I think in the day of the mobile phone, where we're in touch with people everywhere, and Paul was just showing us before that they're in touch with Laith. It just seems absolutely amazing that somebody that lives on the other side of the world, that they can talk to them in their living room. It's amazing. But here we have a man who has never fathered a child and now has a son, which means so much to him, and he has to put them on a journey, and he doesn't know if he'll ever see them again. And we know from that journey it was a difficult journey, and they almost died in the wilderness. But God, once again, stepped in and saved their lives because they were lacking in water. But that's only the forerunner of what God is now going to do to Abraham's other son. So what amazing man Abraham must have been. We come to the closing part of this moving story, and we've observed a character which has grown and deepened, mostly through difficult times. And I think sometimes we need to remind ourselves of that. It is through the difficult times in life that God develops our characters. We don't just become the people that we are because we're the people that we are. We become the people we are through circumstances. Some people seem to have a rosy life and nothing untoward ever happens to them, and they are very fortunate if that happens to them. But for some, that's not the path they tread. And I would say, looking around here, and I know quite a lot of people, there have been very difficult times in people's lives. There have been dark, dark days. But God has fashioned you and molded you into the people that you've actually become. So not only is Abraham obedient, he's unselfish over the land dividing with Lot. He's incorruptible when it came to taking the loot. He didn't want it. He showed courage when he went to rescue Lot with armies. He went and concern and compassion over the business of the city of Sodom. And now the ultimate test of his character. And God tests Abraham's his obedience. And it's not to watch him fail, but to deepen Abraham's capacity to obey God and thus develop his character. And you see, once again, we're learning that it's through those times that God's developing his character. Now, many years ago, when we used to have solo singing and duets and things in churches, I used to sing a song, and quite a few will probably be reasonably familiar with the words. And it always spoke to me, this song. When I think I'm going under, part the waters, Lord. When I feel the waves around me, part the sea. When I cry for help, oh, hear me, Lord, and hold out your hand. Touch my life, still the raging storms in me. Now, these times in that song are not peculiar to any one person. They are situations that we all get into. There are times in our lives when we feel that everything is slipping away and we don't know how to handle the situation. It can be a whole host of different things for all of us here. And one person's trauma or crisis, you would think, well, I'm quite sure I could cope with that, but you don't know their circumstances. It's the story, isn't it? Until you've walked in somebody's shoes, you don't know how you would feel about things. But I do know in my life there have been quite a few occasions when I have felt that I was slipping beneath the waves. And I felt that everything was just going away and I couldn't see any way ahead. And we're going to hear about a similar circumstance that happened to Abraham. But God is always there. In the communion service in the little room this morning, Lex brought a lovely picture of the shepherd and the sheep. And if you get a chance to ask him and he'll show it to you, it's a story of a sheep in a very difficult, precarious place on a rocky ledge. And the shepherd is bending right over to rescue the sheep. And that's what God's doing with you. You might feel as though you're falling under the waves today. You may feel as though the circumstances of life are really rubbish for you. And you look around at other people and you think, nothing ever happens to them. They do not know how I feel, but God knows how you feel. So the sacrifice of Isaac, that's where I'm getting to, became for Abraham the ultimate test of his character. And God told them to go on a journey. He told them exactly where to go. And it took them 3 days to get there. And he told Abraham that he was going to make him sacrifice Isaac's life. Now, if you had to go on a journey with a loved child that you had waited 100 years for, what would have been going on in your head? You would have all sorts of mixed emotions. So with them, they have the wood for the fire. They have the flint to light the fire. They have the knife. And Isaac is very curious as to where the sacrifice is. And once again, he watches his father build an altar. And once again, what is going on in Abraham's head? He thinks, I'm building this to lie my son on it and then kill him when I've waited all these years for him and God has promised me faithfully that he's going to bless me through this boy, and now he wants me to take his life. God had been guiding them ever since they'd left Ur, and he'd never let them down yet. And so he ties Isaac and he lays him on the wood, on the altar. And he raises the knife to perform the act. And then God intervenes. An angel of the Lord shouts at him, Abraham, Abraham, lay down your knife, for now I know God is first in your life. God took Abraham to the brink. Maybe a reminder to us all. We often ask, why is God allowing this to happen to me? Why is God allowing this to hurt me? Where are you, God, in all of this? And maybe that is for us a test of our faith. So as we ask the band to come up to the platform for the rest of the end of our service, I'd just like to remind us all that wherever we are today in our lives, in acceptance lies peace. Not challenging God all the time of these things that are happening to us. And I'm speaking from experience, as you probably can well know. And these are not just words I'm saying. That in acceptance lies peace. None of us know what the end of our journey is going to be. And many of us walk away from God when the going gets tough. But maybe through this glimpse of Abraham's life, we might be encouraged to see that walking God's path through the difficult times is character building. Thank you.
This is the end of this message. We hope you enjoyed it. If you want to find out more about our church, please visit www.chowdean.org.uk. And please take a minute to rate our podcast on iTunes.